Hi and welcome back. Thank you for joining me for another episode in this series. I am very excited to share with you that I am getting up to date with technology and editing, and so changing the format of this content from next week onwards. I do intend to add more visuals, perhaps insert videos which would explain important legal principles, all to make this series as interesting and gripping as possible. So this is the last time we see each other in this format. Sit back, relax, and let's delve into today's trial. Today we'll discuss something that has been deemed to be one of the most appalling miscarriages of justice in the UK during the 20th century. 1949, on a dark autumn evening, a short young man on his name Timothy Evans walks into a police station in Wales and asks to speak with a police constable. He firstly maintains that he disposed of his wife's body in a drain at 10 Rillington Place, North Kensington in London. The reason being an abortion she wanted to carry out. Swiftly, police officers have been deployed at the address, but no body is found. In a state of reported confusion, Evans then changes his first account to include a so-called Christie, who lived on the ground floor at 10 Rillington Place and who was an abortionist offering his services to his wife. After the three of them have apparently agreed to the abortion being carried out, Evans returns one evening from work to find his wife dead. At this site, Christie warns Evans that he would be accused of murder if Beryl's body was found, and so they concocted to dispose of her body in the drain. The following morning, Evans goes to work as normal and leaves his young daughter Geraldine in the company of Christie, who reportedly gave her to a young couple to look after her. To this, Evans quietly agreed. He also agreed to get out of London before his wife's disappearance was discovered. Seemingly mesmerized by Christie's instructions, he complies and he goes to see his family in Wales, whom he tells that both Beryl and Geraldine are away on holiday. At this new account, the police start searching 10 Rillington Place again, more thoroughly this time. In the meantime, Evans gets escorted back in London from Wales, where he was told about a shocking discovery at his place. Both bodies of his wife and daughter have been found in the wash house behind some loose floorboards. The cause of death was put down to strangulation. In an extraordinary unfolding of events, Evans gives a third statement, changing his story yet again. He now maintains that in a fit anger at his wife's profligate spending habits, he strangled her and then carried his body in the wash house. He also strangled his young daughter with a necktie, citing no reason for doing so. So after these startling and confusing accounts, he was eventually charged with the murder of his wife only, because back then the criminal practice was to only charge a defendant on a single count of murder, even if they were suspected of more than one count. The purpose of this rule was to prevent the potential prejudice to the defendant that a multiple murder counts might create. To be charged with two murders can create the so-called circularity of proof. In other words, each charge might be seen or construed to substantiate the other. The neighbor whom Evans had blamed in his second statement on his full name, John Reginald Christie, seemed to be a model of respectability. He served in both world wars as a police officer and married his wife Ethel, both living a quiet life at 10 Rillington Place. Christie, however, was stricken with various health conditions. Evans was also stricken with tuberculosis and lupus and spent part of his childhood in a sanatoria, being unable to read or write properly, not even in the adulthood. This aspect, we will see, would prove fatal in his case. In the days before his trial at the Old Bailey, Evans cries out to his mother, "I have never done it, Mum. Christie has done it. Tell Christie I want to see him. He's the only one who can help me right now." Despite his absolute state of confusion and disorientation, Evans was only offered a legal representation 2 weeks after he was remanded at the Old Bailey, awaiting trial. Malcolm Morris was set to defend Evans, considered initially a defense of insanity. For the prosecution, we had Christmas Humphreys, who had a very strong case against Evans. On the one hand, we had the cold and groundless murder of a toddler, and on the other we had the killing of his wife because of their financial troubles. So in a nutshell and quite simply, the prosecution case was Evans lost his job, he was depressed, argued with his wife, and as a consequence he killed her and the daughter as well. So the testifying begins. Police officers testify to the discovery of both bodies. A map of the 10 Rillington Place is shown to the jurors, which evidenced the route Evans had to take to reach the house, the wash house. The most important aspect here is that the wash house was overlooked by Christie. By far the most important witness for the prosecution was Christie himself, who was anything but calm and very composed in the witness box. He confidently testified that in the night of the presumed double murder, he and his wife were in bed when they heard a loud thud, as if something heavy was being moved upstairs. The next morning, Evans had reportedly told Christie that both Beryl and Geraldine have gone to Bristol and that he will be joining them shortly. Evans then reportedly sold all his furniture because he could not take it to Bristol with him. While still in the witness box, Christie managed to victimize himself greatly by reminding the jury, the birds are very vocal today, by reminding the jury about the sufferings he had to endure during the both world wars he was in whilst working as a police officer. So the last thing jurors remembered from this first day of the trial was not Christie as an abortionist, but rather the wartime police officer. On the second day of the trial, Morris, the defense, cross-examines Christie. He sounded extremely convincing when denying any involvement in any criminal activity. Like a seemingly good neighbor, he reportedly warned Beryl not to stop taking pills to procure an abortion. How could such a caring man be capable of such heinous crimes after all? So the image of this good neighbor was still intact, while the jurors were mesmerized by Christie's composure. His wife, Ethel, also sat in the witness box, and it quickly became clear that her account had been doctored carefully by her husband as well. The only witness for defense was Timothy Evans himself, still confused, uncomprehending, and very frightening he was set in the witness box. None of his relatives were called on his behalf. Reading the trial transcripts, which are now available, is heartbreaking. How could a person, in this case Evans, follow so blindly Christie's instructions? His answers during cross-examination were inarticulate and confusing, highly incriminating and damaging for his defense, and yet none of his defense intervened. Much of the time, Evans misunderstood the questions being asked. It was reported that he did not even understand the word plead, as in pleading guilty or not guilty. Floundering, he pleaded not guilty and maintained all throughout the trial that he did not know about his daughter's murder until a police constable told him. Evans's defense was really thin. After the closing speeches, so the trial lasted only 2 days, after the closing speeches the jury retired, only to return after just 40 minutes with a guilty verdict. It was reported that Evans looked stolid as he was led down the steps into the cell. There was an appeal, but it was dismissed. This was the end of the road for Evans. In March 1950, he was hanged by Albert Pierpoint. It was reported that he consistently maintained his innocence until the last day of his life. As we now know, the hanging of Timothy Evans is one of the most appalling miscarriages of justice in the UK during the 20th century. His case, although, contributed greatly towards the effective abolition of the capital punishment in the UK in 1965. Some half a year after Evans's hanging, 10 Rillington Place was sold to a new landlord. In this time, Christie's illnesses and health conditions have become more pronounced, and after spending some time in the hospital, he told his neighbors that he was moving to Sheffield. Shortly afterwards, the new landlord, 10 Rillington Place, made a shocking discovery whilst trying to knock a bracket off the wall. Behind some loose floorboards, he discovered 3 female corpses, all wrapped up in black cloths and crammed into a small cavity. Police rushed at the scene, of course, and only then, around 3 years after Evans's hanging, they were able to piece together the truth. Christie was not Evans's kind neighbor, but one of the most prolific criminal in Britain. His garden was dug up as well, and more bodies were found there too. The discoveries shook the national media, who swiftly deployed journalists and camera crews down at 10 Rillington Place. There's a very good movie entitled just like so, 10 Rillington Place, who tells this story. So until next time, you could perhaps watch this for more visual pictures and more facts. Christie was arrested shortly afterwards, and he confessed to the killings of all the men whose bodies have been found. Like we now know, it was the practice then. He was only tried for 1 count of murder, namely that of his wife. He pleaded not guilty on the basis of insanity. Soon he became the sensation of the year, while the court number 1 became packed with literary and political people, all to observe the human condition in this extreme situation. He answered questions about the murders with such indifference, as if trying to recollect whether he visited the tailor on Monday or Tuesday. Christie was, of course, found guilty of his wife's murder after 1 hour jury deliberation, The judge was appalled at the realization that Evans, standing in the same dock where Christie was saying, was hanged innocent, and that he could not have possibly committed all these murders. Christie did not appeal and was hanged by Albert Pierrepoint at the same gallows where Evans had been hanged. Shortly after the effective abolition of death penalty in 1965, Timothy Evans was granted a posthumous pardon and was reburied in consecrated ground. Having now the benefit of hindsight, Evans could not have been guilty of murder. Back then, even the jurors have been told that he was effectively illiterate. So his IQ was that of a 10-year-old. By today's standards, he would also be given access to a solicitor immediately, who would be present during the questioning. If learning difficulties were identified, an appropriate adult would be present at the trial, but perhaps the judge would even deem Timothy Evans as unfit to stand trial. If the defendant looks confused at any point in the course of a trial, then the defense would intervene to provide clarification. One more aspect is that when Evans was questioned, the police constable wrote everything down. Nowadays, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act would require all interviews to be recorded, and this is for accuracy purposes. I hope you've enjoyed today's trial. We will see each other next week for a more gripping and more visual story. And until then, I hope you enjoyed 10 Rillington Place, the movie that features this story. Thank you and goodbye.